Dave here. So I'm back and I'm kind of continuing on with the whole reloading process. Now in the last one, I went over kind of some of the basics. I didn't cover powders. I didn't cover projectiles. I didn't cover any of the more advanced equipment. I went over the basics and the minimums of what you need. And I'm hoping if you did watch that and you are interested in reloading, you're doing your research, because I cannot stress anything above that if you're reloading, you're dealing with these chemicals, you're dealing with these projectiles, you're dealing with the safety hazards that come with it. You are doing your research to make sure you're doing this in the safest way possible. I know that Lee, Lineman, RB, I know that Hornady, they all have their reloading data. They all have their reloading information. So if you're using their powder, if you're using their bullets, if you're using their press, if you're using anything like, here's Lee, there's reloading information on the back of this that gives you information by weight, by powder, and how overall length should be, how much powder you should use, to what size bullet. Do your research. It is very important. There is also research, and I showed this in the last video, on overall length of the round. This is for 9mm. It is different for every single round. So please, please, please do your research. Now, that being said, there are tools that will make your life much easier. Now, I did go over the basics that you need, like calibers. You definitely need that. I did go over the basics that you need, like the sizing and the chamfering tools that you need. And those are important. Those are very important. There are tools that you will need, that you will create, like the depriming tools. That is a process that I do that can actually be made easier, and I'll get into that in a second. Now, not using the manual process that I showed in the last, there are inexpensive ways to get into presses. Now, this is a Lee this is a Lee reloader press. It is a single press, single stage, very minimal system. It is a very inexpensive system. And as far as getting a single stage press, this is really, it was sufficient. Now, will it work for some of the huge calibers like a 300 Win Mag? I have never tried it. I don't think so. However, it worked for the 9mm I used it for, so I imagine it would work for all other pistols. I'm pretty sure it would work for some of the smaller rifle as well. The first thing you have to do is you have to mount it down on a surface very securely. I have popped this off the surface before, and I had to re-secure it. But you want to pop this down onto a surface very securely, screw it down in all three positions, and then from there, make sure you position it so, and there's a ledge, I don't know if you'll see it, but there's a ledge right here that goes to the edge, and this is flat on your surface. Now, one thing that was not explained in the instructions is when you're decapping, essentially you're removing the spent primers on a shell, and using a press like this one, there's a hole, let's see if I can see it, there's a hole here that the primer, once it's pressed out, I don't know if you'll see that, yep, down inside there, once it's pressed out, it comes out the back of the press line here, of the press tube, and it goes down out of the bottom of the press, out here. So when I originally mounted this down, I didn't realize that that's what it was going to do. And it didn't say in the instructions, and I wasn't really paying attention. I was just excited to get my new press. Well, what I eventually realized is I need a hole in the bottom of the table that I'm pressing with something to catch those primers. Otherwise, they're going to go all over the place, or this is just going to fill up. You know, a couple thousand rounds, this is going to fill up, and you got to remove your press to get it out of there. So what I ended up doing is drilling about a 1-inch hole underneath here. So I was able to, so all of those would come out. The next issue I had was all of those were coming out, but they were going all over the floor. So I then took a baby food jar and mounted it to the bottom with a hole in the lid. And essentially it would go through that hole, through the lid, the hole in the lid of the baby food jar, and then it would go inside the jar itself. And I was able to unscrew the jar and just dump them out in the trash or recycle, or whatever I was going to do with them, and then screw it back on and it would collect them. So there's things like that you're going to go through. I believe some of the multi-stage presses also deposit them out the bottom, so you're going to have to account for that. So you have your press now. What else do you need? Well, you also need, oops, did I screw up my sound? Nope, it's still there, good. You're also going to need the dies for whatever ammo, for whatever caliber you're going to be reloading. Now, I went with Lee on this one because I bought the Lee press, but RBC sells, Hornady has a version, I believe Lineman has a version, but they're called dies. And I got the 4-piece Parabellum or 9mm die set. They usually come with a shell holder in the bottom. Here, let's open this up and look at what you get. So the first thing I usually do is I never use these cups. These cups I find to be not as accurate as people think. Now, if you're measuring out on your scale and you're scooping, they can be used for scooping. However, I don't find them to be accurate enough to fill your case with every type of powder, because the powders take up different volume space. They're different weights. So I do not use these to determine how much powder. They do come with, almost all sets, come with the shell holder. This slides in the bottom of the press right here, right here, and holds the shell in place. That's what it's designed to do. Then you have your different dies. Each die has a different purpose. This is a sizing and decapping die. I do not use these to decap the shells. I actually either manually decap them using the tools I created, or I actually went out and purchased something called a decapping die. And all this does, and this can be used in multiple calibers, you can see there is a little pin that comes out through the center, and it's actually quite wide in here. This will do multiple calibers. And you can see it's a little bent because I actually hit something incorrectly with it. But these can be used in multiple calibers, and they can be set to multiple depths, and they're for taking out the cap, the, what do you call it? The primer, the spent primer from a shell. And I do that before I clean them. You'll see that this thing is filthy. The reason it's filthy is because I used it on dirty shells. Now, with this specific one, this one's made by Lineman, you can remove the pin and then replace the pin. This is replaceable. I have broken one before. So I did end up having to purchase another one. I was able to find one for very cheap. These are not expensive. These are actually very useful. And then you can use your press to actually press out the primer. The reason why I do not use the sizing tool, the sizing die to press out the primer is I want to press out the primer, clean the shell, and then once it's clean, press it or size it with the sizing die, and then I go and trim the cases down. I want to make sure that there's no dirt inside. I don't want to have to replace the pin in this, first off, but I also want to make sure there's no dirt inside the shell or on the outside of the shell before I press it into the die. I don't want to ruin my die. I also don't want to ruin the shell by having any pieces of dirt or sand or anything on the shell. And then once I've resized it, because you've just pushed the sides back in, the length of the shell needs to be trimmed down. So that's when I go and trim them. So they're decapped, they are then cleaned, and then pressed to size. So that is the process I use for that. And then, of course, you have your next pieces, which you would have your, yeah, I haven't done this in a while. This would actually be the shell that, yeah. So this would be the one that then preps the shell for the bullet and the powder. You would then have this one, which then presses down on there and then presses the bullet in. And then you have this one, which crimps the inside of the shell around the bullet, so it holds it in. So like when you're reloading or loading and unloading your firearm, if you crimp the bullet in or you press the shell back in around the bullet, when you go and rack your slide and push one in, it doesn't seat the bullet any further down. Once again, you don't want to press your bullets in too far because it causes too much case pressure. Okay. So using a die set, you now have a die set. Now, each time, if you have a single stage press and you have a die set, each time you set up to do something with that die set, you have to set the die to the correct length. You have to set it to the correct depth. You have to set it so the bullet seats correctly. There's a lot of different testing and setting and making sure everything is lined up. This is why people end up going to multi-stage presses, so you can set up everything at once and then go through and do them all at once. With this setup, I normally would I would take all the shells, decap them that I was going to work with. I would then take all the shells and clean them. I would then take all those shells and size them, meaning press them into the sizing die. Take them, cut the overall length of them. Then I would prep the shells, usually with a lube of some sort. And then after that, you would go through, you would prime all of your shells. After that, you would then, to prime, this is the next step of priming. That would be using an auto primer. You fill this section here. You can see in the background, I got another one for the large pistol primers. This is the small pistol primers. You would fill this with primers face up, and you would lean it to the back with your shell in here. This comes with its own holders for shells, and you have different size ones. The one that's in here is the 9mm, and when you squeeze this, it presses this little pin up, pressing the primer into the pocket of the shell. Now, if your pockets are not clean, your primers can still go off, and I have set them off doing this. It is not as often. With this set, the Lee, I have found that the cover, this plastic piece, will not always feed primers in properly, and they can double stack on you. So you have to be careful. It is faster than doing it the manual way, but it is not the fastest. Now, there are some presses that have a auto feed and auto prime feature built into them, where a piece, when you're coming down from pressing out your primers, and your sizing and doing your sizing die, when you come down, it presses in a primer at that time. And those are neat. I like them. However, the way I reload, it doesn't, it wouldn't be as effective for me. The auto priming part I like. I would not use it I would not want to prime before I lengthen the case. And before I lengthen the case, I want to make sure it is sized correctly. Once again, because as you shoot, the case itself expands. So what you end up having to do is press it back into shape, and you want that overall length of that case to be correct before you start reloading with it. And that is what has always made sense to me. Not everybody does that. Some people will go ahead, length their case before they do it, before they size them. They'll do all this stuff before they size them. And that's fine as long as they're comfortable with that. I'm not. So that's not the way I do it. But I prime the case. Then I will go and flare the case, prep the case type thing. In that case, what I also have is an auto primer. So I will usually have this press where I have all of these cases. I go through, I have a case holder sitting on my left, which is basically just the plastic pieces that you would get out of ammo packs or ammo boxes. And I would place the rounds in there face down, no primer, so I can inspect the pocket as I'm setting it down. And I know that the primer is empty, the primer pocket is empty, everything is ready. And then as I go through the stages, I'm using those same racks to hold the empty cases and eventually the full rounds. Then what I do after I've prepped and flared the case ready for its next round, I'll go through and I have a perfect powder measure from Lee that I use, that you put it underneath and you spin it and then you load with that. And I'll show that in another video. But in this case, the other thing that I wanted to touch on is a good scale. Now, I have a Hornady scale. It is not top of the line. It is a little bit of expensive, but it is not really, really expensive. And it is worth it to get a good scale. You want to make sure that you are throwing the proper amount of powder. Now, with this scale, it does come with a powder bowl. It does have a tare, so you can make sure that your powder bowl is not included in it. And it comes with a calibration weight. So in this case, what you would do is you would turn it on. You would set it into calibration mode. There's instructions on top. You have a 1 ounce calibration weight that you would set on it. It would calibrate to that weight, and then you're ready to start measuring. Now, these are very, very sensitive, so they can pick up the slightest grain. So what you would then do is you would test your pour or your powder. If you're using this to charge your shells, the act of putting the powder in the shells is called charging them. If you're using this to charge your shells, you would use your scoop from your die set, your scoop out some powder with the scale on, put your powder in your powder tray on your scale. And once you had the correct amount of powder, you would pour that into your shell. And you would do that for each and every one. Now, there are companies like Lee, Hornady, RBC, Lineman. They all have their own powder measure system or powder system that you can use. However, you do still need to test them. So you can set the amount of powder that is dropped from the measure for each one of these. Some of them mount on a press, and it goes through the press and drops through the die. You'll see that the die has a hole going all the way through it. Here, I'll show you that one. Die has a hole going all the way through it. Looks like this looks like a funnel. It is. That's where you would pour the powder down. This is the flaring die. This flares out the shell, so when you drop your powder or charge your shell, it lands into the shell and you're ready to go. So the reason why you still need a scale, even though you're using an auto powder, you have to test it. You have to set it. So what I would do is and I'll go into this, but you definitely need a scale and an accurate one. So one of these ones that you would find for your kitchen, this is so much more accurate. Now, I've often joked with my wife, if the cops ever came in, they would think this is for drugs. And, oh, this still has batteries in it. That's not good. Probably should have to replace those. But I did have to go out and buy a scale. So a scale is very, very, very important. When you decide on what you're going to do, the scale, the primer, as far as like pistols, you can usually find a system that will work across. The dies are by caliber. You will have to invest. So if you do start off with 9mm and you decide you want to do 380, you have to get a different set of dies for the 380. If you decide you want to do 40, you have to get a different set of dies for the 40. Each one of them has their own set of dies. They don't have to be the same brand as the brand of press. Those usually go across. Now, what I've seen a lot of people do is when they start reloading and they go with a single stage, I never did, but if you go with the single stage, then what you end up doing, or what a lot of people end up doing, is they get the multi-stage. And what is the multi-stage for? The multi-stage allows you to set up a set of dies, all of them at once, and then you go through the process of sizing, depriming. And this is where they've taken clean brass. Sizing, depriming. Lifting up, primes the die. Pushing back, and then you switch to the next die. The next die flares it out. You push down, and it pours the powder. You switch to the next die. You push it down. You put your bullet there. You press it down into the case. It seats the bullet into the case. You turn to the next die. You press it down and it crimps. If you have one. If you don't, then you only have the 3. And this also allows you to preset these dies in this. So a lot of the multi-stage presses have removable collars where you can set up all of your dies in the collar for 9mm. So say you're loading 9mm, you say, okay, I need to switch to, I need to do 40 as well. So you have your collar of your 9mm dies. You work with those. You have everything set for that. And then you need to switch to 40. Well, each time with these removable collars, you're able to remove that from the press, put on your 40 collar with your 40 dies, and then you just have to make sure you're using the correct primers and you're using the correct amount of powder, and you've switched out to your correct bullets. You don't have to reset up your dies. You do have to test, even once you've set up. So even once you've set up your dies, for the correct length, you want to make sure you're measuring every so often just to make sure that you're still pouring the right amount of powder. You want to take a shot of powder to make sure your powder is accurate. You take that shell out that you just dropped powder in, pour it onto your scale, make sure it's still accurate. You do not want to deep press a bullet, not press it deep enough, over flare a case and split it. Pour too much powder, not enough powder. Things like that, because that can cause problems later when you're using the ammo. This is getting to be a little long. I'm going to go ahead and cut this off here, but this is a little more advanced. There are other things you can use, but this is moving into the more advanced setup. In the next one, I think what I'll go over is bullet options, powder options, different shells, what to look for in the shells, how to actually clean the pocket, things like that. But this is Dave. Let me know if you have any experience with reloading. If you do, what is your experience? What kind of press did you have? What kind of press do you want? If you were to reload, let me know what you would reload. I mean, what is your favorite round to reload? I found 9mm to be pretty easy. Go ahead and like, share, subscribe. If you'd also like, check out my wife and mine Twitch channel. We stream every Friday night. We do old school NES games. We did try some of the newer stuff, but didn't work out so well. But check us out at Jen and Dave on Twitch. And this is Dave. We'll see you next time.